It has a lot of the stuff in it that we're going to be talking about tonight. And this is to complement that exhibit, not to replace it. So it's a little summary of what's happening in the world of whales in America from the very beginning. And incidentally, this photograph here, that ship in the background is a car carrier. So this is a modern picture, not an old one. I was looking for something to convey the history of the whaling industry in America, and I ran across data on the number of whale ships in service by year here in America. And if you go from the date on the bottom here at 1835 out to 1872, that's about a 35-year stretch of whaling history. It's by no means complete, but it was something that I had data for that I could plot on the graph and show you the movements in the industry. In 1835, there were about 500 whale boats, whale ships rather, in service in America. And then 10 years later, that number jumped to about 750. That's that top bubble up there. And then you can see a fairly sharp decline where over the next 25 years, it dropped from 750 ships down to 200. So what we're going to cover this evening, 3 sections. One, where was the growth coming from down in this area here, before that blue double? The golden years of whaling, which are being above this line right here. And then finally, some of the factors that cause the decline of the industry. So that's what we're going to see tonight. Let's start from the get-go. This was colonial whaling. And this is from the time that the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. And what did the passengers above the Mayflower discover? Whales milling around their boat as they landed. So whaling in North America had been here a long time, but new to the colonials. And the Indians were practicing whaling long before the colonials arrived, and they were mainly doing drift whaling. Drift whaling is where an Indian wakes up in the morning, looks out, and he's got a whale on the beach. The whale either ran up there on its own, got washed up, or ran up and died. Okay? But since the tribe was probably pretty small, that was enough, and the whales, depending on the size, weren't all that big and all that difficult to manage. So drift whaling was the way to go. Then it developed one step further into shore whaling, where small boats would go out in groups of 2 or 3 or 4, and they would what I would call herd the whale towards the beach. That's when they would annoy the whale, shoot it, slap it with their bows and arrows, that sort of thing, and force the whale up on the beach. Didn't like that. But then once the whale got on the beach, then the processing could take place. So drift whaling and shore whaling with very simple tools at the beginning. Then Nantucket comes on the scene. We know Nantucket is a whaling port, and the way it developed was that a group of Quakers, these settlers were Quakers, wanted to branch off from the main group, and they wanted to go out on their own. And so they decided on Nantucket. And they bought Nantucket, the island. Now, it's not certain, from my sources, who they bought it from or what they paid for it, but they considered it theirs. But remember, these were mostly farmers, And what they discovered pretty early on was that the soil on Nantucket was not very good for farming. So the question became, well, what are we going to do to make a living? Well, there was an Indian tribe living out there, and the Indians were very willing to show the colonials how to do this. And so they teamed up and they began a whaling operation, and they began exporting from Nantucket whale products that they had caught with the cooperation with the Indians. And so in fact there was an industry of whaling blossoming. Then came along a fortunate discovery, and that is the discovery of the sperm whale. And what happened was a boat took off from Nantucket on a whaling trip. A storm came up, took the boat much farther offshore than it had ever been, and the people in the boat discovered something new, the stern whale. Well, this turned out to be quite a discovery. We pause here, and can you imagine yourself, that swimmer? That's a baby whale, obviously, but he has a smile on his face. Little did he know that when he got big, he was going to get harpooned. Anyhow, that was the sperm whale meetup off the coast of Nantucket. Now, why is a sperm whale so important? It is the whale's whale. If you had to have any kind of a whale and you had your first pick, it was the sperm whale. It is the largest of the toothed whales, right? And it's about 62 feet long on average, weighs over 90,000 pounds, is a very deep diver. They're found in every ocean, and they primarily eat squid. Now, why are they so valuable? We've got whale oil, which is the oil that is rendered from the blubber that is underneath the skin of the whale. Then we have what they call sperm oil, which is unique only to the sperm whale. And that is a thick, waxy substance that solidifies at room temperature. It's ideal for candles. So this sperm whale, ambergris was in the gut of the whale. Nobody knows exactly where that comes from or how it's formed, but that was to extend the fragrance of perfume. Bone, meat, these were all valuable products. But what made the sperm whale unique was this source of sperm oil. That was the valuable part of the whale. How big is a sperm whale? We often see this comparison right here. Whales compared to school buses. So here we have a sperm whale that is on average 52 feet, 90,000 pounds, compared to a school bus, the biggest school bus there is, 40 feet, 33,000 pounds. So that's the relationship of the size. So you can imagine a whale of that size, an animal of that size, washing up on your beach. Several ways to capture and process a whale, and these methods would dictate what kind of equipment you would need. First of all was drift whaling. We've talked about drift whaling already. That's when you wake up in the morning and a whale is on your beach. And so you just cut it up and divide it up and use it amongst your group. Herding, we talked about. That's when you get out and torment the whale, drive it up on the beach, dead or alive, and then cut it up on the beach. That's processing. Now the next method, and getting a little more complex, is you kill the whale at sea, and then you tow it to the beach where it gets cut up and distributed. Then the third or fourth level is also a sea kill, And that's where you kill the whale, you cut up the whale, and then you take it to the beach and process it there, render the oil. Then finally, the most complex and expensive of the process is that you kill the whale at sea, you butcher the whale at sea, you process the whale at sea, and you store all the whale products at sea. So it becomes a factory ship. That's what that is. So each of those requiring various levels of sophisticated machinery. Okay, we're going to ease into whaling's golden age. And beginning about 1812, rather, and going up to about the 1850s or 60s, we have 900 ships whaling worldwide. 735 of them are in America. So this is very clearly an American business. That's in 1846 those numbers come from. Here are the New England whaling ports. This was a New England business, and each of those black dots you see is a whaling port. The peak year in whaling was 1853, and this was a pretty good year. 8,000 whales were caught and landed, the American whaling industry, 103,000 barrels of sperm oil, 260,000 barrels of whale oil, 5.7 million pounds of baleen and bone, and all of that in those dollars back then worth $11 million. Now I was curious, I said, well, what would those numbers be today? In today's money, instead of 11 million, it would be 319 million, and that would be worth, if 8,000 whales were caught, about $40,000 a whale. So that's a reflection of how valuable these animals were. Here's a story, one among many, of ship owner George Howland. He was a New Bedford whaler. He owned 15 ships. Now, of those 15, over the course of the whaling cycle, he lost 5 in Arctic ice, he lost 2 by fire, 1 sunk by a whale, 3 lost at sea, and 1 destroyed by a Confederate gunboat. Well, you add those up, that's 12 out of George's 15 ships. But the good news is, in 1852, George died a millionaire. He had a pretty good business. Now, how did the money get into the hands of the investors and so on? Agents who were actually the investors in the whaling community, they would buy the ship, build the ship, fit it out. They would hire the crews. They would take charge of selling the catch, and then they would what they call spray and pray. Spray meaning they would invest in more than one voyage at one time to protect themselves in case one went wrong. They didn't lose all their fortune. So that was spray and pray. It was a profit-sharing business where the investors, agents, they would get half to a third or 2/3 of the proceeds from the sale of the catch, and the rest would be shared amongst the captain, the mate, and the crew. Now, you can bet your life that the investors were going to make sure that they took care of themselves. Right? The whale wages, gotta believe, pretty low. Right? But with the profit sharing, nobody made any money until the catch was sold. And so that's when things got divvied up. So that meant that if you were on a whaling voyage, you stayed out as long as you possibly could to fill the ship. And sometimes that was as long as 5 years. And one of the stories I read, there was a whale ship taking off from New Bedford, about to leave on a voyage, and they were pulling away from the dock. And the first mate says to the captain, "Captain, you forgot to kiss your wife goodbye." And his reply was, "Well, what do you mean goodbye? I'm only going to be gone 2 years." Throughout the golden age of whaling, Nantucket begins to slip and New Bedford begins to rise. What happened? Well, Nantucket, the port, had problems in silting up, sanding over. Couldn't get in and out of the port, and the local sailors and whalers built contraptions to try to lift ships over the sandbar. Nothing worked very well. It was a major blow to Nantucket. There was a massive fire that destroyed most of the Nantucket waterfront. And can you imagine, with all that whale oil around and grease and so on, what a fire that probably was. Then this was around the time of the gold rush in California, and of things going sour in Nantucket, the whale ships leave. They find their way around to San Francisco Bay in California and leave the ships and run off to mine for gold. And the whale ships never got back to Nantucket. Market-driven. New Bedford, why was it so much better? Well, first of all, it was a mainland location with access to transportation, easier to get products and infrastructure in and out of the town. It had a nice deep harbor as opposed to Nantucket. There was access to transportation. It had infrastructure that could handle all kinds of whales. And you can see all kinds of whales on that chart over there on the wall. And they had trees for boat building and for construction of barrels for oil. And they were truly devoted to whaling. It was a factory town. 329 ships out of the 700 in the total fleet. Almost half of the New Bedford fleet was the total of the American fleet. This is a picture I've always liked. Here's New Bedford during the peak of the whaling season. Look at all those barrels. They're all full of oil. Thousands of them. Busy place, dangerous place, slippery place. During this season, there was also a severe labor shortage because of more and more boats going out, more and more crew. Typically, the captain and the mates on a ship were white people from the local stuff in New England. A lot of the crew were people from everywhere, every shape, every color, every ethnicity. And this was an opportunity for black people from the black South to get into something a little nicer than slavery. Although I have to wonder, working on a whale ship, how is that much better than picking cotton? I don't know. Think about it. Now the whaling industry begins its decline. That's that downward trend you saw on chart number 1. The number of whales, I mean, if you keep on catching 8,000 a year, pretty soon you're beginning to run out. And that's exactly what is happening. So with the fewer number of whales, the cost per whale increases. Then we have a number of things that are affecting the industry, and they all seem to be happening at one time. First of all is the discovery of oil, and from oil you can distill kerosene, and kerosene becomes a principal fuel for lighting. And kerosene basically replaced whale oil as lighting in American homes, candles and lamps in a very short period of time. It's because the whale stuff got too expensive. There was also the Civil War that interrupted production. The South didn't have much of a chance in hurting the armies of the Union, so they reasoned, let's go after their industry, and that was the whaling industry. So two Southern ships, the Alabama and the Shenandoah, captured 52 whale ships during the Civil War. It's a huge number. Most of those would have been from New Bedford. There were also Arctic disasters. We'll talk about those in a minute. We'll also talk about the invention of electricity. And so Thomas Edison was getting ready to wire up, I forget the name of the town, Philadelphia or Baltimore or one of those, with electric lights. And those eventually replaced kerosene and whale oil. Also the development of steamships, 1869 or so. That's when steam began to take over sail. And so steam obviously can get it around quicker, possibly more volume, right? But a lot more expensive to make. So it's one of those developments that raised the cost of whaling to where whaling could no longer be competitive. Talk about some important whaling stories here. One is the tragedy of the Essex. And you've probably heard a lot about the Essex. That's the story that inspired the novel Moby Dick. The Essex was out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, way in hell gone from nowhere, and 1,000 miles at least from the nearest land, when a large white whale attacks the ship. And then it attacks it a second time. And it just so damaged the front, the bow of the boat, that the boat sank. So 21 men on that boat were set adrift in a couple of whale boats. They floated around, just currents and wind, and were on the sea for 4 months before they were back where they wanted to be, and just 3 sailors out of the ones that were left survived. That's the inspiration for Moby Dick. Another one you'll hear less often about is the tragedy of the Anne Alexander. This is in August of 1951, in about the same location as the Mid-Pacific, when they were attacked. Up to 3 times the whale attacks the ship. And the ship sinks, 22 men pile into 2 whale boats. Now whale boats, give you an idea of the size, 6 oarsmen, 1 steering, and 1 harpoonist. So that's 8 people in each boat. And these are not big boats. These are the boats that are hanging on the sides of the larger whale ships. So luckily they were picked up by a whale ship by the name of Nantucket. The whale ship took them on a ride to Peru in mid-September. So now they're on the water for more than a month. And then they were back in New York on October 12th. The 22 men survived. Now we have something that really slammed the whale industry, the big freeze in 1871. 40 ships headed up into the Arctic, and they're chasing bowhead whales. Those are sometimes known as polar whales. And we have some baleen on the back wall there from the bowhead whales. By September, 1,200 whalers had abandoned their ships, and they piled into 100 whaleboats, and they got out of the ice, and they made their way to Hawaii. In the end, 33 ships were lost in the Arctic. 22 of those ships were from New Bedford. So a big hit for the New Bedford fleet again. Amazingly, no lives were lost in that accident. Here's another big freeze, 1876, just 5 years later. These guys are, they're intent on heading for the Arctic and condoling with these things, but that's where the whales were. 300 men leave the ships after they got frozen in, and they walk 20 miles to shore. Can you imagine walking 20 miles over ice to shore? I can't. 50 of the men decide to stay behind. 12 ships were lost, but only 3 survivors were found the next season amongst those 50 men that were voted to stay behind. So, another disaster. Now we move into California, getting closer to home. Shore whaling in California becomes popular. Why shore whaling? Well, the target animals were California gray whales and humpbacks, but more Californias than humpbacks. And they learned over the years that the California grays, they hug the coastline as they migrate north and south, so they were fairly easy and inexpensively caught. And so a distance, for example, between here and Nantucket Island, a whaleboat could row out that far, capture a whale, and bring it back to shore and have it processed. So it was mostly a range of up to about 10 miles. And these, the capturing was done in small boats where it was at the level of capturing that I illustrated in an earlier slide. It's a sea kill, a tow to the beach, and then the beach does all the chopping up, cutting up, and processing. Some of you have heard of Captain Scammon. Captain Scammon wandered into a lagoon in Mexico and discovered pods of gray whales. And they're all swimming around the boats. And boy, you know, he's stumbled onto a real find here, a real treasure. Yeah. Well, California, this was in 1957. California was a little late in the game in getting into whaling. Well, for one, we didn't have the population out here. We didn't have the infrastructure of a couple of 100 years of learning how to build whale ships and so on. And most of the action was around San Francisco, as you'll see in a later slide. The gray whales, what also happened was that they learned that they were about to be killed. And so they got very feisty, very dangerous, started flipping over ships, smashing with their tails, and so on. So they became what was known as the Devil's Ship. Then more advanced